welcome to Tar Heel Teachers Presents a conversation with Dr. Thomas Benson, and author of Legacy Created and principal of Hoke High School. I'm Marlow Artis. Join us for this discussion as special guest co-hosts are a group of North Carolina educators who have read the book, and they also know Dr. Benson quite well. At this time, we'll start our introductions.
Good evening. My name is Jorris Edge. I work for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools as a school counselor, and I have been in education for 20 years.
Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Good evening, good people. I am Dr. Hawkins, and I am currently a K-5 counselor at the UNCG Moss Street Partnership School, which is one of the 6 laboratory schools here in North Carolina. Just want to say it is an honor and a privilege to be in this space. And I have been in education now for about 18 years.
Good to see you, Dr. Hawkins. Thank you for being here.
Evening, everybody. I'm Mr. Mellon, and I've been in education for about 10 years, and it's a pleasure to be here as well.
Glad to have you.
Good evening, friends. I'm Suzanne Sell. I am a first-year principal at Salemburg Elementary School in Sampson County, and this is my 23rd year in education.
Awesome. Glad to have you. In his recently released memoir, Dr. Benson recounts his experiences growing up in the South and his impactful career as a North Carolina educator. Dr. Benson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Really excited to talk about this book, Dr. Benson. You did such a great job with the book. I have so many questions, and I know the co-hosts do as well. But what prompted you to not only write your story, but to publish your story? A lot of us have stories to tell, but we actually don't take that step of writing it and publishing it. So what prompted you to go that route?
I think, just the unique experiences of growing up in South Carolina, some of the racism, the discrimination, some of the challenges that I face with just my learning, my own, disabilities as far as learning, and how even against the worst odds, I was able to overcome some of that with just great family support, great friends, and just a lot of support from a lot of individuals that kind of helped move me along in my career and my opportunities as a young person.
That is really great. What I really appreciated, Dr. Benson, is how authentic this story was, and just how transparent that you were. You're a successful administrator. You have a wonderful family. There's some things in the book that you talk about that some people in your situation would not have the courage to talk about. Talking about having a learning disability, talking about some of the loss that you had. Really, what prompted you just to be so transparent? Even talking about some of the depression that you dealt with, anxiety. Some people aren't brave enough to do that, Dr. Benson. What prompted you to do it?
Well, I think, from the standpoint of just looking over my life and my experiences, some of that I didn't realize till later in my life that, I was kind of dealing with some things. And, it takes just different episodes within your life for you to realize that, hey, you need to really seek some additional assistance from somewhere else. And so, I've got a couple of different counselors in my family. And just from that standpoint, just some of the advice that I received, I was able to kind of go and just kind of seek some different help, because some of the experiences that I dealt with, as a man growing up in the South, you're supposed to kind of be that figurehead. And you're the one that's supposed to have the big, strong backbone, but you're not supposed to be the one that shows weakness. And so from that standpoint, I kind of held a lot of the different things that I had endured and dealt with throughout my life. And, just kind of talking with my wife, it came to a point where she was like, well, just try to seek some help, and so I kind of reached out to a therapist, and it came to a point where I realized that some of those things that I had endured as a young person, even losing my son, it stayed with me. And so it gave me an opportunity to kind of release, by writing the book. It gave me an opportunity to kind of put it in writing, some of the things that I had endured. And it was almost like a release for me.
I love that. And you're going to also help some other people to release some emotions too, and really have the courage to to seek help and to speak with individuals about what we've gone through. So I think that's really great. What questions do we have for Dr. Benson about A Legacy Created, this wonderful memoir? So good.
Dr. Benson, I actually would like to speak to the frankness and the candor that you have in this book. I absolutely appreciated that. It made me feel as though you and I were sitting across the desk in your office at Jack Britt having a little talk. And one of the things that you were really candid about was your struggle with being identified as a student with a learning disability and just even getting to that point, being bullied, etc. So it made me think about some situations I've dealt with as an educator. What advice would you give to a family or to a student who was hesitant maybe to go down that road and seek out a possible diagnosis or an identification because they're worried about a stigma?
Well, I guess for me, the advice that I would give to a young person is really just, try to make sure that they're communicating with the family. Back during the time that I was coming up, my mom was a disciplinarian. And so it wasn't any kind of diagnosis of dyslexia. And so, I could read a comprehension piece and she would ask me within a second or two what I read, and I could never give her that information. And so, it just took me, time from working with my mom to kind of realize that I needed additional assistance at school. And so for a young person, you have to be willing to kind of give some insight to those around you, talk to an educator, talk to your parents so that they can do the advocating for you, because a lot of times we're stigmatized because of, well, I'm having to be pulled out or I'm having to be singled out by a particular teacher. And I know how that feels, and back then, there was one teacher who would come, Miss Dennis. She would come into my third grade class and she would come and get me, and everyone in the class knew, what the issue was. And so I would just be so embarrassed. And so, with educators, I feel like, there has to be an appropriate way for us as educators to work with kids so that we're not singling them out for one, and just really making it, consistent with how we're trying to help all students, not just that one student with a learning disability, but we're there to help all students.
Dr. Benson, first off, I just want to say thank you again for creating this space, particularly, coming off the, the month of, just, mental health, and just being so honest and frank in your book. I will say that my wife and I, we felt just a little slighted, simply because we were reading the story and was like, we want just a little bit more. Right. Can you give us just a little bit more of what you was giving us? So kudos to you and your storytelling, which prompts my question. In your opinion and from your experience, why is storytelling an important tool to use with regards to understanding people, particularly African-American males?
For one, Dr. Hawkins, I feel like a lot of times we're so bogged down in trying to move our careers and our families till, sometimes we just kind of neglect the challenges that we face. And so from an African-American standpoint, I feel like it was something unique for me to put my story out there. And, I was trying to be as transparent as I could, but I felt like someone somewhere, if it's a young person or if it's a person my age, I'm 50 years old, I wanted them to experience some of the things that were unique. We didn't have a whole lot of games, technology back then. And so it was a pure time. It was a time where, just the simple things meant a lot. And so for me, as an African-American male, the challenges that I faced, and then against all odds with discrimination in different formats and, and racism, I was still able to overcome those obstacles and, was able to kind of give, to young people that I'm working with every day. And so I'm able to continue the legacy. And when I created, a legacy created, it was more in lines with, as a individual, we are touching and creating legacies every day. And so as an educator, that never stops. And so it's all about us and our roles and day-to-day life, with whoever we're dealing with, for us to make sure we're giving them something of us so that our legacy can continue to grow and thrive. And, writing the story was just an opportunity for me to share, all the unique experiences, and from a Black male perspective, give someone who is kind of challenged by some things that they're dealing with as a Black male, the opportunity to realize that, hey, we've all been there, but we can all overcome.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Benson. So thank you again for being transparent in your book. As a counselor, like, I was wanting more and more and more, because, as a counselor, we try to tell teachers, we try to tell parents, like, the foundation of what a child goes through, it affects how they perform academically. That social emotional piece plays a big part, and is now coming out in the schools where they're using that more and more. But it's probably something, as your book shows, that it should have been done years ago. Right. So if you had to, this is kind of a hypothetical question. Okay. So if your book was used for like a training for educators or parents or students, what would you want them to gain from your book or learn from the book?
I would want them to know that some of our practices, even though, we're trying to do things that are positive for kids, sometimes it's not in a positive way for kids. And so what I mean is, there are times when we have games like in the book I talk about Red Rover. We're playing a game that is supposed to be just innocent and sweet. But if you're like myself, the only Black male that was out there, and most of the times, and you're never called, your self-esteem is beat up. And so there are games that we play now, as educators, that sometimes we're singling kids out and we don't even realize it. And so we hinder them, and we hurt their self-esteem based on just things that we have done historically over the years. And so it's all about making sure that we're mindful of what we're doing and the impression that it gives to those that may not even be, the popular person or the popular student. Because a lot of times it's all about, individual students trying to create their own opportunity, trying to develop their self-esteem. And so from the standpoint of just my book, I would just want someone to understand that, hey, sometimes our practices they're not the most positive. They're great for us to give kids pleasure and opportunities, but sometimes they do a disservice to kids. And so that would be the biggest piece that I would want kids to understand. And then the second part would be just bullying. We're all in situations, as young people where, sometimes you talk about somebody and it's innocent, but based on either social media or based on how someone interprets what you're saying, somebody can take that rumor back, and the next thing you know, you're in a situation. And so I want young people to understand that, hey, we've all been bullied. We've all had situations that we wish we could change or go back and do something different with. But the whole point is making sure that we're advocating and making sure we're communicating with some adult, because some kids don't have an outlet, and they're dealing with these things at school. And what we see now is kids exploding. We've got all these kids that have been home for a year or so, and now all of a sudden they're coming back, and we're throwing them in buildings with 2,100 kids or less, and so it's all about us really trying to make sure socially and emotionally these kids are prepared to kind of deal with the bullying and some of the other social things that kids are doing nowadays, because the social media is rampant. It's the biggest thing, and so a lot of what we see is bullying through the social media. So, those are some of the things that I would want someone to kind of pull from my book is, what are the advocates? Who are the advocates for kids that are being bullied? And, when you're dealing with social media, who is the resource? Who do we contact when we have these issues so that kids don't explode and have issues that, we're sitting back saying, well, what happened with that kid?
Dr. Benson, reading your book, one of the things that I really enjoyed was it goes in order. I'm a big fan of chronological order as a social studies guy. It goes in order of the high points in your life from the time you're a young man into your present. And I was wondering, when you created it that way and you finished it and you sat back, what were your reflections? What was the ultimate, or one of the overarching takeaways or perspectives that you gained that you may not have had before that?
I think the one overarching thing that I got from the entire book is the fact that, there's been so many people, so many coaches, teachers. I wouldn't be anything without, my mom and dad and the family structure that I had. And then thinking about, just your elementary football coach, your middle school, your high school coach, your collegiate opportunities, just the sum of all the unique people that I met and how each of them have given me something, even from, working as an assistant principal with, Conrad Lopes and Cindy McCormick and Steve Hagan. Each of those leaders gave me something that has made me the leader that I am. And so I just think about just the impact that so many people have had on my life, my family, my wife, my kids, and just my in-laws. And so it's all about a collection of individuals that have poured something into me. And that goes back to that legacy part. It's all about each individual you encounter every single day that's giving you some of themselves, and so from our relationship, when I met you, you didn't realize it, but you were giving me something more. And so as a young mentee to a mentor, my whole thing was, you're young, let me see what I can do to kind of help steer some things, in your life. And so it was all about us creating opportunities from where people have impacted me, for me to pour some of those things into you as a man, and look at how you've turned out, so it's all about that legacy.
Chapter 20, now you're talking about that. Chapter 22 is my absolute favorite chapter, talking about how Tony moved from being your mentee to being a family member because you all just had such a close relationship. Tony, I want to know from you, what was your response whenever you actually read this book? Because I've never had anybody write a chapter about me in my life. So what was it like reading what Dr. Benson shared in terms of your journey together?
Of course, I felt honored, and of course I felt immortalized. I felt special, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't say that those feelings were just as potent, if not more potent, when I was 12 or 13 and he first started coming to the neighborhood. And my first interaction with you, Mr. Artis, was signing up for the Blue Ribbon Mentor. Mm-hmm. Not aware that you knew Dr. Benson. I'm not sure you did at that time, but you could clearly see that I was emulating. And that's one of the things I had to mention I was emulating without all the details. But it's funny how things come full circle. Mm-hmm. And so he written about in a very articulate way. I was honored to be written about. But I'd be doing a disservice. I didn't say I wasn't more honored to have Dr. Benson coach me through life. So that's a very special thing that I don't think words can really capture.
It was just so well done. I mean, it's wonderful, Tony, that you end up becoming a mentor after having Dr. Benson as a mentor, and then Dr. Benson just really pouring so much into you and sharing that. I mean, we talk about mentorship all the time, but you two are a real life example about the benefits of a mentor, because so many times we have adults who throw children away or put children in boxes, make judgment calls, but just sticking by someone and really letting them know that you have their back is so important. Dr. Benson, talk about that scene that you have in the book where you talk about when Tony was out on the football field and how the coaches were not doing what they were supposed to be doing and how you had to advocate for your mentee.
Yeah, I sit back sometimes and I think about that time when he was out on the football field, and at that particular time he was just trying to find his way through football, and I know he was out there working as hard as he could, trying to keep up with everyone. And when he slipped, I mean, you could tell he was seriously injured. And I know the coaches just, within just trying to keep practice flowing, they kind of moved over and just kind of left him there. And it burned me up. And at that particular time, that was one of those moments where you show your craziness. And I didn't show it too much, but I wanted the coaches to know that just because his mom or his dad wasn't there, I was there to make sure that somebody gave him the actual care that he deserved as a young football player. So, yeah, I mean, that's what we're supposed to do, and I think sometimes even in working in schools every day, there are kids that are yearning for an advocate, and sometimes, they don't have it. And so it's sad because, if they go home and they don't have an advocate, they come to school and they don't have an advocate, who are they supposed to lean to? Or who are they supposed to receive some type of support from? And so it's all about us every day trying to make sure we advocate in some form or fashion for the young people we work with. Even older folks, I got teachers that I advocate for, and it's what we do as educators. We have to advocate for those that sometimes can't advocate for themselves.
So Dr. Benson, we talked quite a lot about how frank and how candid you are in your writing style. And because of that, some of these topics are pretty raw. I mean, yeah. They're kind of gut wrenching. And so it made me wonder, I think we've touched on the fact that it was probably a bit therapeutic for you to even put these words down on paper. But what was something that you almost didn't put in the book that was just really, really difficult, but you fought with it and you decided it was important enough to go ahead and put on the pages?
Losing Christian. That was chapter 25. That one, that was tough because, when I think about the journey that my wife and I had during that time, it was like, you have all these aspirations as a young dad and, as a wife, and, you have the plans, you bought all these clothes and everything else. And, you're there in the delivery room and it's not meant to be, and so for me, it was more because I think at that particular time, it was like a blur to me. I sat there, I held my wife because even with her, she was battling, her health was not the best. And so I remember, after the doctor gave us, Christian, we held him, and we tried to just kind of keep things together, but the next thing I'm having to deal with is just trying to structure the burial of my son, and so just having family, allowed me to kind of get through it. And when I called my dad was like, hey, this is what, life throws at you. And so you just got to kind of, handle yourself, and try to get things done so that you can take care of your family. Because I still have my son, Thomas, and I still recall, just like it was yesterday, him with all these smiles on his face, and, just being able to really see the joy in him allowed me to kind of endure some of that and move forward. Having family around allowed us to kind of move forward.
Which just kind of echo what the previous question, and just kind of extend that, within our community, specifically with regards to Black men, why is it important to create safe spaces to address our mental health?
I think it's so important because a lot of times when you see what's on the news and in the media, it's almost like we're struggling every day to battle with what we see in the news and how people view us, and so I think, there are times when we're battling with so many different things as Black men that sometimes who is there to really sit and listen to us? I can count on my hand. I don't have a lot of friends, and so sometimes, when within our circles, there are personal things that we just wouldn't share with our best friend, and I just feel like there are times when as Black men, we are so just guarded. We're guarded with just who we are as strong Black men that sometimes we don't want to just expose ourselves. And so with me in this book, it gave me an opportunity to kind of say, hey, I'm just going to relax. I'm going to just open myself up, because it was therapeutic for me. It allowed me to kind of deal with some things that I had been dealing with since a young kid, and so to say to other Black men, hey, take the time to check yourself, to make sure your well-being mentally is where it needs to be, because, the suicide rate for us is not the greatest. We don't have a lot of outlets. We explode with a lot of different things that most people can kind of manage. And so it's all about us really making sure that mentally we're where we need to be so that we can continue to take care of ourselves and our families.
In one of the chapters in the book, you talked about your football injury and then how, it ended your football career earlier than you anticipated, but you turned that around and ended up majoring in sports medicine so that you could still pursue something along the sports field. What advice would you give, a high school athlete or a college athlete when it comes to injury or facing trials or tribulations like that? Because working with student athletes now, they feel like, that the sports is the end all to be all. And if they don't have that, then that's the end of their world and they don't have anywhere else to go or nowhere else to turn. So sometimes they drop out of, college and don't proceed. So what advice would you give them?
I think ultimately, thinking as a young athlete, you have to think about long-term goals. What is it that if my career with athletics doesn't last, if it ends, what's my fallback? What am I going to do, to kind of make sure that things are moving in the right direction? And, with my injury at Wingate, it happened. And I'm not going to lie. There were days when I would go to the football field, the practice field, and just cry and sob, simply because for so many years, it was a part of my life. And so I think just being able to really evaluate myself, I really got close to some folks that were, my athletic trainer, Ruth Hagan, who was just critical in my well-being as far as just being an injured athlete, as well as being, jumping into sports medicine. She kind of pushed me into sports medicine. And she was like, well, with your injury, it's going to give you that firsthand experience of how to socially, mentally help someone who's dealing with some of that, because we see it every day. And so a lot of times injured athletes don't know how to cope with that loss. And so sports medicine allowed me to jump right into something that I was comfortable in, and it helped me to kind of have that empathy and develop that skill of having empathy for those who are injured, as well as having that sports medicine degree where I was able to use the knowledge that I learned about the body, the kinesthetics of things as far as how we function during athletic events, so that I could use all that to kind of help injured athletes come back and perform and be successful. But, definitely, you've got to have a backup plan, because ultimately, nobody's guaranteed an NBA or NFL career. And so it's all about just making sure that you have a backup plan, use your knowledge. If you're smart, focus on the academic aspect. Don't just be an athlete, be a student athlete.
That's great. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Thomas Benson, author of A Legacy Created. We'll be right back. Teachers Presents, and we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Thomas Benson, author of A Legacy Created and principal of Hoke High School. Now, Dr. Benson, in your book and throughout your life, you've had many, many pivots where something happened and you make a change, you make a transition, you just keep going and you just won't stop. What do you really contribute to you just having that tenacious spirit and just continuing to believe in yourself and continuing to press forward?
My dad he's a beast when it comes to just really making it happen. I think all my life, my dad has worked 2 jobs, and he's so committed and just driven. As a family man, he's always felt like, his job is to take care of family. Financially, he's always done that. He's worked 2 jobs and just really tried to just do the things that he could do to provide. And so for me, just watching him and my mom, work together, he's had a business for about 40 some years and it's done well. And just his tenacity, persistence has just kind of spun off on me. And so, my son is at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's put that same type of tenacity and work into his effort of trying to get into Chapel Hill. And I'm so inspired just in the fact of what him and my little girl, Haley, will be able to become, as they get older and stuff. So yeah, my dad and my mom really just kind of laid that foundation for me to kind of have that get up and go and just keep driving.
That's awesome.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Benson, one of the things that is that knowing you personally, you always been a very intensely independent individual. And those that know Dr. Benson know that he is independent. Writing this book is probably about the most vulnerable I think I've ever seen. You as long as I've known you. So I just wanted to know what inspired you to at this point in life to open up and to be more vulnerable.
Well, I just think from the standpoint of working with young people, working with you, working with my son and my little girl, I talk about a legacy created, and in the book, I just want them to be inspired, because their life is not going to be easy. your life has not been easy. And so I just want you all to know that, hey, no matter what is thrown at you, whatever curveball comes at you, you fight, and you continue to thrive because, nobody's giving you anything in this life. And so for me, it just gave me the opportunity to really put it in writing and just kind of let those that read it know that, hey, no matter what the challenges are, you continue to fight and you continue to thrive as a young person or as an adult.
Dr. Benson, just to kind of echo what Tony was saying, from your Uncle Bay to Big Tom to Dr. I want to make sure I pronounce his name correctly. Is it Dr. Bomar?
Dr. Bomar, yes, sir.
Dr. Bomar, to your dad, how did they influence your style of mentoring?
Wow, that's a great question. My Uncle Robert, which is Bay, he's like the coolest uncle. We all have that cool uncle, but he's always just been driven, just always been cool. He's always been focused on his career and his job and his family. And I learned a lot from him. And so with my uncle, Big Tone, just the fishing, taking the time with me, he was a auto repairman. He would go out to the shop and you just go out there and just sit and listen to him talk all day. But he would always take some time. He would always stop what he was doing just to come out, throw the football, play pickup basketball with me. I mean, and it's just, you just think about those folks and it's like, wow, they had so many other things they could have been doing, but they took the time with me. And then with Dr. Bomar, oh, wow. I mean, talking about educators, we talk about folks who impact us. He's that true educator that if it had not been for Dr. Bomar, I don't think the writing, if it had not been for him, I don't think I would be anywhere because during the time that I met him, I was still taking remedial classes. And it was his insight and his will to just say, we're going to overcome this obstacle that you have with learning. He took the time. I mean, it was times on the weekend, he was spending time with me, working with me. And it was his commitment, that commitment as a true educator that I always say, you got to have those kind of folks in your buildings because, he advocated for me. My goal was to receive a football scholarship. And he was able to get me to the point where I was able to pass the SATs so that I could attain that opportunity. So in a nutshell, those individuals, they gave me so much more than, I could have asked for. My dad, just even now, 50 years old, and yesterday was his birthday, turned 70. And so just the wisdom that each of them has given me, it's I can never repay them for that.
So I think that one of the things that a reader of your book can quickly pick up is that you tend to take almost everything that you do as an opportunity to learn something. And so that takes me to the time that you spent at DPI working with federal programs. And I was just wondering, here you are kind of coming full circle because you're the principal of the high school where Leandro started,
right.
And you start thinking about all those inequities that we have in education and the lack of opportunity that many of our students face. So what were some of the lessons that you learned there at DPI about those inequities that we're facing in education, particularly in the part of North Carolina where we live?
Well, I guess for me, the biggest thing that I was able to take from DPI is that schools receive a lot of funding. Districts receive a lot of funding, but the unique thing about those funds is how well they spend them. What do you spend them on? You spend money on, and so it's all about how schools are structured or districts are structured to make the most use or most profound impact of how they use those funds to impact student achievement. And so, that was, I guess, the biggest thing for me. And then as a current principal, looking at money, it's all about the relationship, creating relationships within, with your teachers, with your students. That's a big deal, because you can have funding, but if you're not creating or trying to develop those relationships, the funding, you can buy all these different items and different programs and things of that nature. But if the relationships aren't cohesive within the school, learning can't happen. You can have great students, great performance from the students, but the key thing is without those relationships, it's going to be a challenge to try to make that school a performing school.
So I enjoyed the stories you shared about your younger years being at your aunt's house and the outhouse and those different experiences. But it goes to show, and you mentioned your family several times, that it takes a village to raise a child. But currently in 2021, we don't really see that village for children anymore for the students in our school. And they depend on the school to do everything for the child. So what programs or what do you think the schools can do to provide more of a village concept for these students, since they may not be receiving this at home?
Well, I think the one big thing is, a lot of schools are trying to develop mentorship programs. I think that is a critical piece, that if it's done right and structured and set up the right way, you can give kids the opportunity to feel and have an advocate. I think that's such a big deal, even from the standpoint of just, teaching teachers how to become advocates for kids. Yeah, we're asking the teachers to teach you the math, science, and the English, but it's so many other things that teachers have to do, and even more importantly now, we've got the situations where kids have been out of school for a year or so. And so now they're back in a building, and a lot of our kids don't have the social awareness to kind of manage some of those things because of lack of communication with their peers. And so it's all about us now really trying to say, okay, social and emotional learning, how do we structure that within our building? What do we do, for one, to make sure that our teachers are social and emotionally prepared to deal with the challenges that our kids are bringing? And if you have to evaluate that, I would say right now, that's a new area for all of our schools, is really trying to make sure the teachers' social and emotional and the students' social and emotional piece are intact. Because as long as we have those pieces in place, we can do a lot to kind of make sure that we're doing all we can to advocate for the kids that are being challenged. And so really, I think the biggest aspect is going to be how we continue to develop maybe the mentorship programs, the social and emotional building within our particular buildings.
Just to kind of echo that question too, Dr. Benson, you mentioned one of the biggest things, that I definitely see within my space of work is that relationship piece and that connection that is in many situations is definitely lacking. So my question is, and this comes from, it's a quote that I took on page 89, and you mentioned the only way a teacher can begin to know those things is by taking the time to personally connect to their students through dialogue and time. In your opinion, what is hindering educators from making a personal connection? And how do we begin to build a relationship that reflects what you and Tony have?
Well, I think for a lot of teachers, and I'm not speaking of all teachers, but sometimes we bring our own self-perceptions of who we're working with. And because we have these ideas or these thoughts of how Johnny, Johnny's coming from a Section 8 home. He doesn't have a lot. So my perception is going to fuel how I interact with Johnny. And so what I've got to be able to do, or what we have to do as far as restructuring our educational programs, is try to make sure we are taking and making sure we're training teachers how to take their perceptions out of the picture and try to really take the time to dive deep into knowing Johnny on an individual basis. Now that takes, taking some time to have some dialogue, taking the time to really invest in Johnny. But, when you got a classroom with 25, 30 kids, it takes time, and so it's all about really just making sure that that's part of what we're doing as we pertain to trying to teach the lesson. We've got to continue every single day of trying to get to know our particular students, get to know their strengths, their weaknesses, so that we're able to kind of find a way to genuinely connect to that particular student. Because in most cases, we're going to teach our curriculum and we're going to go home. But we've got to do a whole lot more, because we've got kids that don't have advocates, and we've got to make sure that we're at least trying to make some connections to them. Because like you said, and like I said, the relationships matter. They really matter.
Suzanne, were you going to say something?
I can.
I thought I saw you had your hand on the trigger, like you're ready to go.
I was turning off a sound that was popping up, but actually I do have another question, and it just takes me back to the image on the cover of the book that makes me think of a little Dr. Thomas Benson III. That sounds funny, but if you could go back to that time and knowing everything that you know now and having all of the experiences that you've had, what advice would you give to little Dr. Thomas Benson?
I would just tell him to continue to just learn. Don't get discouraged. Continue to just kind of live life and just enjoy the moment. I think there were times as a young person that I just, I was just living for the moment, the Saturdays, those things that we take for granted now, I wish we could bring back. I wish my son and my little girl could wake up on a Saturday and just watch cartoons and just kind of just be a kid for a moment. We're living in a fast-paced society. And so a lot of times we just don't have those moments where we can sit back and just say, hey, I just want to take in this moment. And so one thing that I would say to him is really just appreciate those valuable moments. We got video games, we got all these different things that are here now, but back then it was all about nature for me. It was all about just embracing living in the country, even going to the cotton field, looking at those cotton buds and just seeing nature in itself is probably the most prized thing. And even to this day, I love nature. I love being outside. I love the fact of just embracing God's creation.
Dr. Benson, as I was reading the book, one thing that has really stayed with me was how you talked about your experiences being in a predominantly white school, and how you really felt like you were in a fishbowl because, you were isolated in many ways and singled out in many ways, and the discrimination. Were you aware of that in the moment, or are those things that you kind of think about and you reflected upon, and just how your experience was growing up as you got older?
At that time, I don't think I acknowledged it or recognized it. I think there were times when I would kind of feel funny. There would be moments where we'd have little dances, and because there was very few Black females there, I was just left standing, just kind of being left out. And so it was a lot of times, going to the swimming pool, as a young person. I mean, I remember the stairs. I remember, coaches, my elementary coach, I remember my mom having to come and choose some folks out because they weren't treating me with the respect that everyone else was receiving. And so it's just those kind of moments that you see, but you don't realize it And as you get older, like when I transitioned from elementary school to middle school, it was like a brand new world, because at that time, I had several different elementary schools diverging into the middle school. And so I had more black folks that I could see like myself, that allowed me to just kind of say, well, dang, it's not just me. I'm around others like myself. And so, I guess that elementary experience, even in its worst case, it was valuable lessons for me. And so I wouldn't change a thing. Life in itself makes you who you are. And, I embrace it. I know back home, I still have so much regard and respect for the folks who touched my life and changed it for the better. And so, like I said, I'm just thankful for my experiences.
Dr. Benson, I wanted to ask you real quick, what advice would you give for educators on how to remain consistent? This is something that I've observed as a vital part of your being, and knowing you as long as I have. And it's something that personally, as an educator, that I myself have struggled with. But I kind of admire you in the sense that consistency it just seems to always be with you somehow. So I would just want to know what advice you have for educators.
The advice that I would give to a future educator or an educator currently is really just to be consistent with who they're trying to become. If you want to be a great teacher, learn all you can learn. Don't just go into a position just to say, well, I'm receiving a paycheck. And I see that a lot. I see a lot of folks who don't like kids, but because it's a paycheck, they feel like, well, I'm just going to continue to ride this out. But you do a disservice to so many kids because they're expecting you to advocate for them. I've asked kids, what is it, who's your favorite teacher? And a lot of kids will say, well, I don't have a favorite. And to me, that's bothersome because of, we're supposed to have the kids' best interests. We're supposed to advocate for kids. And for any student to say, well, I don't have a favorite, somehow or another, we've done a disservice. And so the advice that I would give to any teacher is to really make sure that if you're going to be a teacher, truly invest in being a master teacher. Learn the pedagogy, learn the knowledge and things that it's going to give you to make a young person's life better. Because 5-10 years of a teacher that is not there for the right reasons, you're going to kill kids based on the fact that you're not there for the right reasons. And you're going to hold them, they're going to be in a situation where they're not going to have the knowledge that they need to continue their life. And so we've got to do a whole lot with just making sure that we have the right people in our classrooms doing the right things for kids.
That is awesome. Dr. Benson, this book is so good. I really, really enjoyed it. So glad that we had a chance to have this conversation. Now, I know that with you writing this book, this can't be the only thing that you're going to write. So do you have any other writing projects in the works?
I'm almost complete with during the time that I was with DPI, I had an opportunity of working with the distinguished schools. And those schools are the high performing and high proficiency, high performing schools. And so I've done a compilation of some of the schools, some of the unique things that they were doing. And this was from 2019-20, prior to COVID, some of the unique programs, things that they were doing to really become distinguished schools. And, with that, I talk about, the things they were doing, the relationships within the schools, as well as what type of federal funding, because these are all Title I schools. And so to have that, so that if I've got a new principal, you got a teacher that's wanting to know what are some of the best practices, this particular book, when it comes out, will give, educators, teachers, principals, the opportunity of kind of knowing what were some of the best practices prior to COVID. And maybe, some of the folks that may want to try some of these things can pull from it and use it as a reference or a guide.
Oh, I can't wait for that to come out. When you publish that, you'll have to come back and talk about that book. But we really appreciate you coming and talking about A Legacy Created. Such a great book. If you have not read Dr. Benson's book, please make sure you pick it up. We want to thank our wonderful guest co-hosts so much for joining us. Jorris Edge, Dr. J. Hawkins, Tony Mellon, and Suzanne Sell. And once again, we'd like to thank our special guest, Dr. Thomas Benson, author of A Legacy Created and principal of Hoke High. We look forward to seeing you next time on Tar Heel Teachers.